Good afternoon. My name is Terry McGuire. I'm a member of the Canada Underground Railroad Center, and I'm going to present a PowerPoint that I made a little while ago concerning different forms of opposition to slavery in 19th century America. I'm going to share the screen with you, and that usually takes a step or two. Okay, there we go. Now, let me adjust this just a little bit. Okay. Now, I'm also going to get rid of me. I find that when I'm making these presentations, being able to see myself talking makes me rather self-conscious. I'm self-conscious enough. So I'm gonna keep talking, but you won't be seeing me anymore. Okay. Don't know if this is working. Well, let's see. I'm recording this, and I want to say about the Canada Underground Railroad Center. It's about 21, 22 years old, and our mission is this: to preserve the heritage and inform the public about the historic abolitionists and freedom seekers in this area and beyond. In the matter of enslavement of people of African heritage, most Americans in the 19th century were indifferent because it didn't apply to them. Many Americans, oops, just a second. Many Americans, mostly in northern states, but also in some southern states, were opposed to the idea of slavery. A very small portion of the American population actually owned slaves, and they were in favor of slavery, not too surprisingly. And a sizable minority believed that slavery was right, even if they didn't own slaves. This presentation will focus on the Underground Railroad, one of the most effective forms of opposition, and it will also examine other means of opposition and protest to slavery. The Declaration of Independence, one of our two most famous documents, speaks of the notion that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Underground Railroad in this area and elsewhere was part of an enormous effort beginning in the late 18th century. Shortly after the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, to rid this country of slavery and to attest to the truth of that statement. This is a map of Chester County in relation to the Underground Railroad. Particularly in Chester County, just north of Delaware, there were many families we live in an area that was of extreme importance to the Underground Railroad. The Eastern Line, one of the lines that was most productive in helping freedom seekers escape from enslavement and move to freedom and security. On this map, you can see the paths that were taken by freedom seekers. Note the red line from Wilmington north, meaning that it had considerable traffic. I'll explain why later. Particularly in Chester County, just north of Delaware, there were many families whose homes were stops on the Underground Railroad. You can see the Mendenhalls, the Barnards, the Coxes, Evan Lewis, whom I'll talk about a little bit later. There's Evan. Here are the Barnards, Mendenhalls, and Coxes. You also see Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, who came to this area and spoke against slavery. Southern slaveholders considered Kennett Square a hotbed of abolitionism, and that they meant as an insult. Many of these people were Quakers. In fact, when the first histories of the Underground Railroad were written, one had the impression that almost all were Quakers. We've learned over the years that this was not so. A great many were local African Americans and their families, but their histories, their stories were much less often told. However, thanks to new researchers, including our own KURC colleague, Michelle Sullivan, we've learned more about the African Americans in this area who were supporters of the Underground Railroad. Why was Chester County attractive to freedom seekers? Well, first of all, African American population was only 2% in Pennsylvania, but 8% in Chester County. In Kennett Square, 16% of the population was African American, and that included some property and business owners. There were several exclusively Black communities: Bucktoe, Hinsonville, Sixpenny Creek, among others. And also there were at least 26 functioning African American churches, many of which were active in their support of the Underground Railroad. What did it mean to be one of the station masters of the Underground Railroad? What if your family was among those folks? What would it have been like? You had to expect to be awakened on any given night by a fugitive or five, or rarely, but on some occasion, even a dozen or more. Did it happen every night? No, by no means. But at any night, it might. Sometimes several times a week, sometimes once every few months. But those families had to be ready. Your family had to spring into action, preparing a meal about midnight, tending to medical problems as well as you were able, perhaps replacing worn out shoes or other items of clothing. Your family had to have a large stock of food, medical supplies, and clothing on hand, not for their own use, but for people whom they'd never met and would probably never see again. You had to find a place for those fugitives to sleep, or you had to get out the wagon and hitch up the horses and move the freedom seekers to the next station. If there was a sense that slave catchers were in pursuit, travel had to be swift but silent, and that on unlit dirt roads. You might be surrounded by neighbors who were not in sympathy with your belief, who either didn't like the idea of giving former slaves freedom, or at least didn't want slave catchers, generally regarded as violent, nasty, low-class persons in their neighborhood. Incidentally, the prospect of meeting these sort of people on a dark, unlighted road at 3 a.m., they well armed and you with half a dozen fugitives they were about to capture, that would be frightening for you as well as for your charges. Yet, a few dozen families in Delaware, and perhaps a few hundred families in Chester County, face those tasks at any given night, and sometimes during the day, and perform them faithfully from the early 19th century to 1861. There were a great many more known abolitionists in Pennsylvania because it was a free state and Delaware was a slave state. And in fact, the Delaware State Assembly did not approve of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, until 1901. It had become the law of the land, but they didn't pass it. There was no hierarchical organization to the Underground Railroad. Knowledge of stations, the homes where freedom seekers could reasonably hope for shelter and aid, were passed around by word of mouth. There was very little written correspondence for the simple reason that it was too dangerous. As far as we know, only one person kept records of those passing to safety. And this is he, William Still, with an impressive title, Secretary and Chairman of the General Vigilance Committee of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. Vigilance in this case meaning being constantly on the lookout for ways and opportunities to help those who are escaping. Still had a lot of correspondence with Delaware's Thomas Garrett, the most important station master on the East Coast. Still kept Garrett's letters, but he kept them well hidden. He assisted 700 freedom seekers himself. He used information to help reunite families and also to bear witness to the life slaves lived and their courage in seeking freedom. Once, while listening to the story of one somewhat older freedom seeker, William realized that he was talking to an older brother, Peter, whom he had never known because William's mother had escaped to freedom after Peter was sold and before William was born. William still kept those notes very carefully hidden until after the Civil War, and then he produced the first major book on the Underground Railroad, published in 1872, based on those notes, over 800 pages long. It offers remarkably broad and vivid accounts of conditions of slavery and the determination of those who refused to accept that status. Of course, the Underground Railroad was not the only means of opposing slavery. I'd like to discuss briefly several other efforts to abolish slavery and the people who undertook those efforts, and then compare their efforts to those who labored on the Underground Railroad. One major source of anti-slavery sentiment were the publications, mostly in the North, anti-slavery newspapers and tracts. Perhaps the best known and in some ways the most successful was The Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison beginning in 1831. In his first edition, he wrote, "I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." There are those words, and there's the first Liberator. Garrison scorned the idea of compromise, and in fact, in one public demonstration, he burned a copy of the Constitution because it had allowed slavery. Garrison and other writers, editors, and orators were profoundly influential on Northern whites and Northern free blacks. They galvanized much Northern white opinion against slavery within the South, and encouraged Northern Black expectations for the abolition of slavery. However, he had almost no influence on the Southern population, in part because Southern states banned the distribution of the Liberator, and also because he relentlessly attacked slaveholders for their greed, immorality, and hypocrisy. Garrison apparently never imagined that people who were denounced for their sinful ways are often not convinced, but rather they seek rationalizations to justify their choices. Southerners began to create a body of thinking and writing that viewed slavery as God's will and the natural order of things. They viewed their relation to enslaved people as paternalistic, like fathers, looking out for poor people, unable to support themselves independently. They developed an ideology of slavery. Pro-slavery ideology became more conscious, thoroughly articulated, and central to white Southern identity. One of these was George Fitzhugh, who wrote The Sociology of the South, in which he argued that some persons are born to serve, and quite magnanimously, he admitted that some white people could also be slaves. Thornton Stringfellow, a Baptist minister, scoured the Bible for evidence that slavery was sanctioned by God himself. James Henry Hammond, who as a senator from South Carolina gave a speech in which he He claimed that all great civilizations are like a noble edifice which had to be built on a mud sill. That, of course, would be the slave populations. Though very few Southerners actually owned slaves, the majority of white Southerners came to accept the notion of its rightness, and they bitterly resented Northern accusations against them. There was also armed resistance to slavery and the spread of slavery. Here's a very famous man, John Brown, a major figure in the fight against slavery. He was convinced of its evil, and he consecrated itself to his abolition. His method was simple: armed resistance. He organized people in Springfield, Massachusetts, and elsewhere to resist slave catchers, and in some instances, killed them. In 1856, he moved to Kansas, where he and his family and followers fought against pro-slavery forces with some success. He also led anti-slavery forces on several nighttime home invasions that resulted in the massacre of pro-slavery men and older boys, the so-called Potawatomi Massacre, where the pro-slavery men were captured and killed with swords. In 1859, he attempted to foment an armed uprising of slaves against Southern slave owners at Harper's Ferry. That attempt failed and led to his execution. He became a martyr to the cause and to many Northerners. Another effort of that attempt was to greatly strengthen the resolve of Southerners to look upon Northerners as wishing to destroy slavery by destroying them, the Southern people. He was, in effect, a terrorist, using some of the same methods modern terrorists use. No one can question the sincerity of the ideals of these two men. I do not in the slightest question the rightness of their goals. I do, however, question their efficacy. Did Garrison personally ever free a single slave? No. Did Brown do the same? Perhaps in repelling and killing slaveholders in Massachusetts, he had some dealing with the Underground Railroad. Mostly, though, he believed in direct and violent action. What these two men did most effectively was to galvanize Northern opinion against slavery, and equally well, to galvanize Southern attitudes against abolition and the North and for slavery. The methods of the Underground Railroad, in contrast, they helped tens of thousands of former slaves towards freedom. They did so almost exclusively without violence. Following the Quaker principle, there was that of God in every person. The principle said to them that one human being could not own another. It also said to treat those living in sin of slaveholding as deluded and corrupted by their conditions, by their traditions, not as evil beings who deserve to die for that sin. Here are three local people who embodied that attitude. Thomas Garrett was the most important station master on the East Coast, perhaps in the country. Starting as a young man, he dedicated his life to helping God's poor. Once he was caught, tried, and convicted and fined $5,400, virtually his entire net worth. Asked if he had learned his lesson, he said, "Judge, he has left me without a dollar. But I say to you and all others in this court, if anyone knows a fugitive who needs a friend, send him to Thomas Garrett." He added that he would redouble his efforts in that regard, but he never attacked a slaveholder or a slave catcher. Harriet Tubman was the greatest conductor of the Underground Railroad. She first escaped in the autumn of 1849. Almost immediately, she started earning money to allow her to return and get other members of her family out. Garrett supplied Harriet Tubman on at least 8 trips back to the South to help fugitives escape. Though it was known that there was a person coming back and helping others escape, and a reward set for her capture, she nonetheless returned at least 18 times, helping perhaps hundreds of people become free. Tubman was illiterate all her life, but she forced herself to be a very effective speech maker in the area of Upper New York State and New England. She was prepared to use violence and carried a pistol with her, though she never used it. To Tubman, gaining freedom for her people was more important than getting revenge. Enoch Lewis was earlier than these others. He was born in 1776 and died 80 years later. He was helping fugitives to freedom even before there was a railroad. He was a math teacher and one of the founding members of the Westtown School in 1799. In 1803, attempting to free a Black man who had been captured to be returned as a slave, he offered to buy the man, whom he only knew slightly. Lewis put up $300 for that sale when his annual salary was $500. How many of us would give 60% of our annual income to help a friendly acquaintance? Lewis did. Another time, he accepted a 5-year-old child from a fleeing slave and reared the boy for the next 10 or 12 years until he could secure for him employment on a British freighter where he would be safe from recapture. Lewis took the approach of John Woolman, the great Quaker minister. Woolman in the late 18th century visited southern plantations in Virginia and Maryland, attempting to use reason and respect in order to get slaveholders to free their slaves. Often, Woolman was successful, and so was Lewis. He wrote of Southern slaveholders that, quote, the system was entailed upon them by their ancestors. Injustice demands the admission that evils, both moral and political, are more easily discovered than removed. He suggested, quote, avoiding every expression that could provoke or exasperate, remembering that the slave owner as well as the slave was a man and a brother. The spirit in which many abolitionists conduct their agitation was one he could not approve of, and he feared lest the antagonism it provoked would retard the desired reform. In other words, while you're trying to get slaveholders to give up their slaves, you're forcing them to justify themselves. And that's where you get back to that pro-slavery ideology. In short, Lewis advocated calm reason and kindly personal appeal than trumpeted outrage to gain his point and the freedom of former slaves. Those Quakers and non-Quakers who undertook the dangerous and demanding life of being conductors and station masters of the Underground Railroad represented a different way toward the elimination of slavery. It was quiet, modest, unself-righteous, and effective. It is estimated that the Underground Railroad around the country helped between 40,000 and 100,000 fugitives to slavery. I could strongly wish in our present polarized America and world, we had more men and women who would emulate both their attitudes towards solving problems and their dedication. If you have any questions, you could contact us at this email address or go to our website, www.kennetundergroundrr.org. Thank you.